Hi, my name is Nina Grace Montes, and this is my research project on the comparison of ESPN's coverage of the men's and women's College World Series. Scholarly research has found that traditional sports media have framed women in a way that made femininity more important than being an athlete. The content has rarely provided depth or analysis for female athletes the way that is done for men. Daily sports shows like ESPN's SportsCenter have not increased the amount of women's sports coverage in 3 decades, but the content has improved. ESPNW, the women's sports brand, was launched in July of 2010, and now there are women's sports-specific broadcasters and content creators that discuss games and players, something that the men have had for a long time. ESPN has also never fully addressed the power dynamics and socio-political context that shaped women's sports. This project analyzes coverage of the 2023 Women's College World Series by ESPN to determine whether it fits into the pattern of gender stereotypes in sports media, such as less important, less relevant, sexualized, comical, amongst others. It also compares coverage to the Men's College World Series, the male counterpart. The content analysis compared live game broadcasts and written articles from the 2 World Series to see if they reinforce gender stereotypes identified by previous research. Although softball coverage hasn't been the focus of a lot of scholarly literature, the sport has come a long way. Softball came to be accepted in the early 1900s as the female equivalent of baseball because the image nicely coincided with the image of women being the weaker sex due to the sport featuring a smaller diamond. As softball continued to grow, the American Softball Association, which is the major governing body of the sport, became concerned with the image of women softball players being unfeminine as the media stressed the masculine characteristics of professional players. The mass media has become one of the most powerful institutional forces for shaping values and attitudes of modern culture. They portray dominant images or symbolic representations of American society and then turn around to tell audiences who and what is valued and esteemed in our culture. A 2002 study on the visual and textual constructions of femininity in Sports Illustrated found that 10% of articles and photos covered female athletes or women-specific sports. In the rare instances where they were shown, the photos were more pose than action shots, and the stories were more often non-sport related. Often, women's sports stories show up in the news as one-and-done situations, meaning after it happens once, they won't show it again. Something that suggests that ESPN does not allow viewers to build or sustain interest, knowledge, or emotional connections to these athletes and teams. Broadcasts build audience for men's sports while positioning women's sports as unimportant and less interesting. Media executives continue to give corporate restrictions and place limitations on their coverage, despite the proof of profitability of women's sports. Deloitte, which is the largest financial company in the world, forecasts that in 2024, women's sports will generate a revenue that surpasses $1 billion, which is a 300% increase from the industry's evaluation in 2021. A record-breaking 92,003 fans watched the University of Nebraska volleyball game to set the record for the largest crowd to watch a women's sports game ever. The 2023 FIFA Women's World Cup had 2 million in-person fans over the course of 64 matches. The 2024 NCAA Women's Basketball Championship game between the University of Iowa and the University of South Carolina drew 18.9 million viewers, making it the most viewed college basketball game ever on ESPN. These figures show that when networks invest in women's sports, the return is high. But eventually, the bigger sports media outlets started to switch from overtly denigrating to being obstinately respectful. In 2017, researchers established a contemporary gender framework called gender-bland sexism that disguises sexism against female athletes as a reaction to individual athletes' merits and performance, which make women's athletic accomplishments appear lackluster. However, gender-bland sexism superficially extends the principles of merit and fairness to women in sports in ways that reinforce gender hierarchies and codify individual assessments during moments when men and women are supposed to be perceived as equal. Many scholars contend that media outlets actively shape news through contextualization, influencing public perception before events occur, particularly in sports coverage. For example, the framing of sports events often begin weeks in advance to create a type of hype. This has not typically happened with women's sports. However, the framing of women's sports is frequently attributed to a supply and demand rationale, which in itself is a product of media framing. Executives, producers, editors, and other people who have power have claimed that there is no market for women's sports, even though they haven't done the work to create one. This often leads to male athletes being portrayed as heroic in their big performances, whereas female athletes are diminished by coverage that emphasizes their femininity over their athletic ability. And then this pattern extends to how sports like softball are portrayed. The Women's College World Series wasn't not on TV until ESPN received the rights from the NCAA in 2000. 16 years later, ESPN started to expand its coverage to all 16 regional sites. In 2019, ESPN boasted its most watched Women's College World Series production with a 40% increase in viewership. The two-game championship series against the UCLA and Oklahoma averaged 1.57 million viewers and 1.1 million viewers throughout the entire tournament. After the explosion of viewership in 2019, the sports media conglomerate began to increase coverage on both linear and digital networks such as ESPN+, promoting the company to offer a record high 200-plus games. The 2022 Women's College World Series Championship against Oklahoma and Texas reached a peak viewership at 2.1 million, making it the most watched college baseball or softball game that year. In order to do this research, I coded articles and broadcasts from June 6th to June 10th for softball and June 23rd to 27th for baseball, ranging one day before and after the championship series. While other sports media outlets cover these events, ESPN holds the exclusive media rights, implying an expectation for them to deliver more comprehensive and innovative content. This arrangement stems from a 13-year extension contract between the NCAA and ESPN for national broadcasting of college baseball and softball. To address my first research question, I determined the number of stories provided by ESPN beyond live game coverage through their website and Google searches. I downloaded qualifying articles using a PDF Google Chrome extension and then subsequently categorizing them. Each file and article was organized by sport, then by day, and then further classified into game recaps, feature stories, and previews/analyst articles. For research question 2, I identified common adjectives and descriptors by systematically reviewing each article and live coverage transcript. I entered them into a Qualtrics form, categorized based on prevalent themes in women's sports coverage, including descriptions of face and/or their body, off-the-field roles, comparison or similarities to male athletes, or a matter-of-fact tone, meaning bland, no excitement added to it. Additionally, I incorporated aspects commonly found in men's sports coverage, such as assertive and dominant language, along with lavish accomplishments. In addressing research question 3, I created a separate category on the Qualtrics forms to distinguish if it was in-game or outside coverage sources. After completing the surveys, I conducted a comparative analysis of the themes from both types of sources, drawing on the data from research question 1 and 2, and examined the circumstances influencing specific patterns. It's noteworthy that this research did not involve a secondary coder to ensure data consistency or reliability. Additionally, themes and framing were not coded for photo or video accompanying written articles or TV coverage. So out of the total 23 media pieces coded from TV and print, each one captured information about ESPN's efforts and priorities while covering these two events. The data found that while softball broadcasts in some way had stronger production value than the men's baseball broadcasts, with more creative elements such as graphics, music, player segments, and replays. With that being said, though, the baseball broadcasters had more action-packed language, and they had more excitement and energy in their delivery. And then in the softball written coverage, it lacked creative elements compared to baseball. Softball held that matter-of-fact tone and covered it more as like a news story, whereas baseball added some storytelling aspects to it to make it more feel like you're reading a book or just more comfortable for the reader to read. So this study was not completely consistent with the existing research about women's sports, specifically with women's basketball and Olympic sports. In many ways, it's an improvement. Common stereotypes identified in research about coverage of other women's sports, including focusing on athletes as women, mothers, and/or wives, were absent. And while the softball written coverage did not carry the same excitement as men did, with less attention to character and scene and historical perspective, it did not reinforce gender-specific stereotypes that have been found previously. In addition, the in-game production for softball was more creative and engaging than baseball's, making the game easier and more fun to watch. Since the 1980s, broadcast coverage in women's sports have consistently had lower production value than men's. By using fewer camera angles, statistics, and graphics, lower sound quality, sports media has depicted women's sports in less dramatic and spectacular ways than men's. But the 2023 Women's College World Series did not have these issues and in some ways had higher production value than the men's. but our findings in certain ways did mirror the existing research, particularly in the depth of coverage. Previous research has noted that in one-and-done situations that are common in women's sports coverage. So when the stories appeared on a website, sports newsletter, or social media, they're often obscured by a cluster of men's stories that precede it, follow it, or are longer in length. There's a path forward for these equality and equity based on these results. The growth of viewership for college softball coverage in recent years reflect the success of the strategies for live game coverage, which has given softball more prominent exposure. This shift in viewership patterns suggests that given the attention and the love that men's sports receive, women's sports can captivate a large and dedicated audience. Thank you for listening.